Hello, good afternoon. My name is Dhruva Jaishankar. I'm Executive Director of ORF America. Welcome to ORF America for those of you here in person and for those of you who are watching. We are here almost on the one-year anniversary of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan and the takeover of Kabul by the Taliban to discuss, in some ways, the consequences looking back and looking ahead. And I'm joined by a really excellent panel. I'll give you a very brief introduction to them, although their biographies are available to all of you. We have with us to my immediate left Annie Pforzheimer, who is formerly a US diplomat, served as DCM in Kabul, but also previously served in Afghanistan amongst many other places during her career, including Turkey, Mexico, many other places. We have Masoud Andarabi, who had been Interior Minister of Afghanistan until early 2021. He previously worked in intelligence in Afghanistan and with the United Nations. Lisa Curtis, who for 4 years served as Senior Director at the National Security Council during much of the Trump presidency for South and Central Asia, covering Afghanistan amongst many other things, a very broad portfolio. She previously worked in the State Department, in US Congress, and in the intelligence community. And finally, joined by my colleague, Sadiq Amini, who's Program Manager here at ORF America. Sadiq's from Afghanistan, joined us earlier this year, previously worked at the US Embassy in Kabul for 8 years. With that introduction, we are having this discussion just a few days, in fact, after the killing of Ayman al-Zawahiri, the number 2 in al-Qaeda for many years, who succeeded Osama bin Laden as the leader of al-Qaeda. To many people's surprise, there was an announcement by President Joe Biden a few days ago that he had been killed in a drone strike in Kabul, reportedly in a safe house associated with the Haqqani network. And so I thought we'd start today's discussion before looking back a little bit more about US policy in Afghanistan and also the road ahead, to discuss a little bit about this recent development. So maybe if we can start with Lisa Curtis. What do you make of Ayman al-Zawahiri's killing? What does his presence in Kabul at this time, reportedly again in a Haqqani network safe house, what does that indicate to you?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here, Dhruva, and my first time at ORF's office here in Washington, D.C. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, the elimination of al-Zawahiri is a major victory for U.S. counterterrorism efforts. Somebody we had a lot of intelligence resources on, had a great deal of focus on for a long time to come. There were even times when I was at the National Security Council when we thought we were close, but at that time he was thought to be in the Pakistan tribal areas. So I think a lot of credit goes to our intelligence professionals, their dedication, their determination, sticking with the target, and then the professional way the operation was conducted. It does show that over-the-horizon counterterrorism operations are possible. It doesn't show that the U.S. will be as effective in dealing with the terrorism threat overall, because of course we had a lot of resources on Zawahiri. There was a lot of attention. There will not be as many resources on every potential terrorism threat in the country. But I think, in this case, we do see that over the horizon worked, and we can do it if we're determined. However, the fact that he was sheltering in a home owned by Sirajuddin Haqqani, the Interior Minister of the Taliban, really means that the U.S. needs to rethink the way it's engaging with the Taliban. The Doha Agreement was supposed to prevent the Taliban from harboring al-Qaeda. That agreement seems pretty meaningless right now. I think for many of us, it was not a surprise that the Taliban, especially the Haqqani network, was sheltering al-Qaeda. But for those who were, arguing we had some kind of Taliban 2.0 or, they had changed, Hopefully this has woken many of those people up. Because I think what the Taliban has shown time and again over the last year is they have changed very little when it comes to both human rights, women's rights, and counterterrorism issues. And I would go as so far to argue that the Doha Agreement helped to legitimize the Taliban, and it undermined the morale of the previous Afghan government. Because what was the message that the Doha Agreement told our partners? It told them that, we're switching horses on you. We don't believe a genuine peace process is possible, so we're hitching ourselves instead with the enemy that we've been fighting for the past 20 years. I think that is the weakness of the Doha Agreement. It really was a surrender agreement, pure and simple. Now, we've heard Secretary Blinken say that the fact that Zawahiri was being sheltered by the Taliban is a violation of the Doha Agreement. But I would argue that the wording of the Doha Agreement set us up for this very thing to happen, because the Doha Agreement doesn't demand that the Taliban break ties with al-Qaeda. It doesn't demand that the Taliban expel al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. And as we know, al-Qaeda by definition, by its very existence, is a threat to the United States. So I'm not sure why this fact has been lost on so many people, but hopefully now that we see the top al-Qaeda leader was sheltered by a Taliban leader, somebody part of the Taliban cabinet, hopefully people can see this more clearly now.
Minister Andarabi, as Lisa mentioned, the Taliban made commitments not to host, or did not in fact make those kinds of commitments to host, not to host terrorist groups. But what do you think is the larger significance of the presence of Zawahiri in Kabul now?
Hi to you and to the panels and the audience here. I think the relationship between the Taliban and the al-Qaeda has always been there, and they have been ideological. So they believe on common cause, and that's something that is very hard to break when you have an ideological belief. Yes, there are words that the Taliban are saying, and they have been using language during the Doha Agreement that could attract a point or give the message that there could be a Taliban 2.0. But since deep among themselves or in their beliefs, they are sympathizers to the radical form of Islam and the spread of Islam across the world. So it's very hard that you could distinguish them with the words that they're using. So with that, the relationship exists during the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan and US presence in Afghanistan. The Taliban was using the al-Qaeda as a technical support for their suicide attacks, for their other form of attacks, financial supports, and that continued. And throughout the 1 year after the collapse, there has been numerous reports of continuous engagement of certain Taliban leaders with Haqqani. There has been reports that even they provided Afghan national passports to individuals within these groups so that they no longer could be claimed that they are not Afghans. And I think the fact that Zawahiri was struck in the heart of Kabul, a mile from the palace, and the guest houses of the number 2 almost in the Taliban group, is now made it public, which shows the danger of this group could pose in long term. And not only the expansion of al-Qaeda, but the promotion of radicalism in other terrorist groups that are strive to destabilize US or the region.
If I can shift course a little bit, I mean, looking back, you saw from December 2001 onwards until last August, some big changes in Afghanistan in this period, when you were in government, when you were out of government. Looking back, what do you think some of the most important developments were in this period?
I think I can talk long about that, and some of the audience I see would love to talk about what was those. The number one, I think, it could be looked at different ways, from a political way, from social, from economy, from human rights, across the life of an individual. But number one, I think, was the hope. Every single Afghan, including me, including all the women in the country, had a hope. I was talking with the colleagues, like I was here in 2017 and 18 doing my master's with maybe hundreds of other Afghans who were doing their master's here. And we returned in 2018 with the hope that we got the better education and we're going to build that country. And women were cabinet ministers, women were journalists, women were in different areas. So everyone had a hope that we are going to have an Afghanistan that's developed. Yes, it was challenging. It was a young democracy. It was facing a lot of issues, corruptions, everything. But the hope was there that we can fix it. People lost their fingers going to vote. Yes, there was corruptions in the voting. There was issues with the votes. But the hope was there, and people were going despite that. None of those are existing today. Half of the country are women, and they feel that they lost their future. The basic right of education is lost. Forget about going to active part of the community or serve the country. And thousands of Afghans in different areas. So I think we had an Afghanistan that could have been an active partner for U.S. in long term in that region. And, but unfortunately, I think some wrong decisions has turned it into safe havens for terrorists, safe havens for Zawahiri, that he could believe that he is safe enough to go and live in Kabul.
Mm-hmm. Sadiq, if I may ask you, you're an Afghan who came of age in a sort of post-2001 era. What were some of the big developments, and what, from your point of view, looking back, did the U.S. do right or U.S. do wrong?
Thank you. Glad to be on this distinguished panel. I wouldn't categorize what the U.S. did right or wrong. I look at U.S. involvement in Afghanistan at the right intentions and wrong implementation. There were a lot of great ideas, a lot of great intentions for Afghanistan from the beginning. But unfortunately, with the way it was managed, I think mostly I would blame the post-2001 political and technical leadership of Afghans who didn't properly manage the processes and the attention of the international community. Secondly, I would say that given the fact that U.S. institutions, different U.S. institutions involved, did not have proper knowledge and understanding of the context. Several players involved, more than 40 countries involved in a single country. A number of regional players involved who had divergent goals inside the country and sometimes opposing goals. So I would say, in a simple Afghan terminology, you can literally say that there were so many cooks who were trying to bake one dish in Afghanistan. And so that is partly what happened. I can say some of the major success stories in the past 20 years were democracy, the democratization, as the minister indicated, and the freedoms associated with that, the human rights, the women's rights, education, the media freedom, and others. Secondly, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces was a major success story in the past 20 years, that for the first time, a country in that region had a unified security institutions that every Afghan could associate themselves with. And thirdly, economic development. Significant resources were poured into the country, the largest that country has seen in its history of building infrastructure, education, health sector, roads, electricity, and all. Unfortunately, all of those have been retracted right now by the Taliban, and we are not seeing them. And as was also mentioned on the panel, the way the U.S. went about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, negotiating directly with the Taliban, ignoring an existing legal document that they had with Afghan government, that was the bilateral security agreement, to withdraw from Afghanistan. That led to the collapse of the ANDSF and the state overall. But at the end, of course, there's also another success story of how the U.S. stood by and tried to evacuate their allies. But that process also could give you an indication of how the U.S. does things, that there are a number of successes within it. but there are also a number of failures. And we are hoping that hopefully the U.S. this time, at least at this stage, sticks by its allies and shouldn't give up the project of evacuating their allies from Afghanistan and does not let this project be incomplete like a number of others.
If I can turn to you, you served in Afghanistan, as I said, and multiple times, and saw in some ways how U.S. objectives also changed. Until about 2008, it was still a relatively small footprint, and then you had, in some ways, the counterinsurgency of a much more heavier U.S. military and civilian footprint, and then a sort of a gradual drawdown with its ups and downs. So how do you, from your vantage point, how do you see U.S. objectives changing over time, and what were some of the challenges you witnessed?
Sure, thank you. And again, I'm very proud to be in this company. You actually very usefully outlined 3 different stages, and I would agree with that in broad terms. And I'm thinking mainly about, our policy objectives as essentially stated or otherwise, let's say, marketed to the American people. So the first part was the, let's say, on the cheap, that there was a war to be had in Afghanistan, but the first part of it was successful without that many U.S. troops, having to be involved. And so, there was an effort complicated by the war that began in Iraq to do everything in Afghanistan with as minimal resourcing as possible. And as you say, that went more or less through 2008. And then the period that I served the first time was 2009 to 10, where there was the massive strategy review by the new Obama administration, and that led to the surge. So the second stage was what I would think of as the kind of, if you're playing poker, the all-in stage, where everything was going to be tried. We had the provincial reconstruction teams all over the country. We had incredible amounts of money at play. I mean, that wasn't the case all the way through, but in that period of time, it was really a huge sort of process, and the U.S. forces were fighting, and people from the U.S. Army were dying. The intensity of emotion there, when I was serving the first time, was that anything we were doing would potentially be putting even more U.S. soldiers in harm's way. So we had to think at all times that we were at war, and the spending was somehow commensurate to that. And, that was a lot of troops, but of course with an expiration date that was baked into the policy, which was one of our many, but one of the biggest strategic errors that the U.S. made. So the third phase was essentially the withdrawal. It was fast, it was slow, it was going to happen, it was, then they thought differently. So really starting in 2015 or so, there were different versions of how would the United States be leaving. And I think a strategic error, unfortunately, on the side of the Afghan leadership was, after a while, they no longer believed that we would. So sometimes I think that that complicated the conversation about, taking over responsibility, the military, whether it was ready or not. So that was all of it sold to the U.S. public in different ways as we're at war for this reason or that reason. And at first, it was a very clear linkage to 9/11. What started to happen were 2 things. Number one was, just an obvious reaction to the good that we might be able to do to help women in particular, but Afghans overall, and sort of the widening of the mission. And then the counterinsurgency phase, as you mentioned, the attempt was to make the strategic objectives pretty all-encompassing. You need governance, because governance brings stability, and stability brings a counterterrorism, a lasting counterterrorism solution. So everything pretty much could be justified as counterterrorism in the widest definition. As we began that third phase, though, I think all of the different stories we've been telling ourselves, telling the Afghan people, telling the American people, I think it was a disaster in the end of what we were trying to do and the way that we told people we were trying to do it. I really do believe that the U.S. had a reason to be in Afghanistan and had a reason to stay. And that reason was very much linked to our strategic objectives in that region and our moral imperative. But that's not the story that got told. Those weren't the objectives that were sold to our, to the people, to Congress, et cetera. And I think the result was, a failure of understanding what was literally in our own best interest and the best interest of the Afghan people.
Lisa, walk us through, I mean, you were in government at the time of the National Security Council. Walk us through in some ways what the sort of end stage of U.S. negotiations, particularly with the Taliban. You've written about it, I think, in Foreign Affairs and elsewhere, but where do you think things went wrong in that process?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, not only was I in the U.S. government, I participated in a lot of the U.S. Taliban meetings that Khalilzad held with the Taliban. And of course, those started in January 2019. And proceeded. I want to talk about the last part, though, since you asked about that. And you'll remember that on September 7th, 2019, President Trump tweeted that he was suspending talks with the Taliban. 2 days prior, there had been a major suicide bombing in Kabul on a NATO convoy in which a U.S. soldier was killed. So it made complete sense that President Trump suspended the talks with the Taliban. Now, I think the problem was how things proceeded after that. So what happened, as you remember, the two American University of Afghanistan professors that had been kidnapped by the Taliban in 2016, Timothy Weeks, who was an Australian citizen, and Kevin King, who was a US citizen. They were released in exchange for 3 top Taliban and Haqqani leaders, including Anas Haqqani. And that happened in late November, about a week before Thanksgiving. So then Trump went to Afghanistan. He visited Bagram Air Base for about 5 hours. And during the press conference that he held with President Ghani, he announced the U.S. would be resuming talks with the Taliban. So then you fast forward about 3 weeks, December 11th, 2019. The Taliban conducted a brazen attack on Bagram Air Base. No U.S. soldiers were killed, but they could have been. 2 Afghan civilians were killed, and about 80 people were injured. Very brazen attack. The U.S. was still in control of Bagram Air Base at that time. And this is literally 3 weeks after the U.S. president had visited Bagram Air Base. Okay? In my opinion, the talks should have been suspended again. They were not. They continued. Then you go to the end of January, U.S. citizen Mark Frericks was kidnapped by the Taliban. And still, the Doha Agreement was pushed forward. There was no mention of Mark Frericks. This would have been an opportunity to push for his release. But nothing was mentioned about him. The U.S. proceeded with signing the Doha deal. And to this day, Mark Frericks is still a hostage of the Taliban. So I think there were a lot of mistakes made, and unfortunately the mistakes didn't stop there. Even after the Doha Agreement was signed in 2020, then the U.S. proceeded to press the Afghan government to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners, including top Taliban leaders who had engaged in green-on-blue attacks against the U.S., the French, the Australians, and the United Kingdom. Now, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, was Morrison, objected very strongly because one of the people that the Taliban was demanding be released, Sergeant Hekmatullah, had basically assassinated Australian soldiers while they were playing a game on their base in cold blood. And so basically Prime Minister Morrison begged President Trump not to allow this person to be released, but indeed he was. And in my opinion, that was totally unnecessary. And why was this something that had to be done? Why did the top Taliban terrorist leaders have to be released? What kind of a peace deal was that? That was, there was no genuine peace process happening. So I think the process should have been conditioned on the Taliban reducing violence, and there should not have been so many concessions made to the Taliban. In a nutshell.
Yeah.
In a nutshell.
Minister Andarabi, from fast forward a little bit to August of last year, and the Biden administration had reaffirmed the drawdown. But from an Afghan perspective, why do you think things collapsed as suddenly as they did? Because even the most pessimistic predictions at the time did not expect particularly Kabul, let alone other major cities, to fall as quickly in such quick succession.
I think certainly it was a collective failure, and Liz have kind of detailed on the international community in U.S. part how it was handled. I think similarly we had issues from Afghan side. Yes, we had competent Afghan national security forces, and I think they didn't fight, and some are arguing that it's their issues as well. But I think the major issue for Afghanistan particularly, obviously marking 15th of August was because the president left the country. So that made it 15th of August, otherwise it could have been any other date. Because there was deals that the Taliban will come later and so on, so that's one story. But the others, I think the highly politicization of everything was the biggest issue that I would see it. The NDSF has suffered and faced casualties and thousands every year in the fight against Taliban. They were very committed, but I think as getting close to the August, the politicians and political engagements has increased to a certain level that the ANDSF started to question who we are fighting for and why we are fighting for. And some doubted that what was planned or not. Obviously, the U.S. peace deal with the Taliban has also kind of spread the news among the ANDSF that the U.S. made some sort of a deal. And then some of the decisions in terms of accelerating the transition of technical capabilities to the ANDSF, which was managed by U.S. Army, all of a sudden said, okay, you have to take care of this, contractors are leaving. This kind of put the ANDSF into chaos. So I think these are the top of it, I think, our political influence on the situation and wrong decisions by the politicians has marked it to that day.
Mm-hmm. So if I can sort of shift the conversation a little bit to looking ahead now, we've discussed, I think, very briefly in perspectives on the last 20 years, in particular the last few years, and what happened in Afghanistan. But looking ahead from this juncture onwards, Sadiq, you've written a little bit about what you think the U.S. should do. Obviously, in the past year, priorities have changed. The Ukraine war has broken out, and more attention to Europe on the part of Washington. We have tensions in the Taiwan Strait, so in East Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Amidst all of this, what do you think the U.S. should do going forward, given its competing priorities?
Sure. I think I understand the conversation in Washington is more right now focused on Russia, focused on China. I would argue as an Afghan that Afghanistan also has something to offer in those conversations, given the geographic location of Afghanistan. However, I wouldn't touch on that, but coming to the CT aspect that is seemingly the only serious concern in Washington with respect to Afghanistan. I would say during 1990s, people heard from similar voices or from the similar people with similar viewpoints that the threat in that country is not as serious and that there are enough capabilities in the region that they could monitor and they could control threats emanating from Afghanistan. And we are all a witness of what happened, considering and believing along those lines of thinking. Unfortunately, I'm hearing similar viewpoints right now, and I would hate it to see something happen, that then once again people start thinking that Afghanistan is important. So I would highly recommend at this stage that the US should not go back to the policies of the 1990s. There is a middle ground. We have tested not doing anything, and we have tested doing everything. Let's do something in the middle. There are so many Afghans abroad right now, so much political capital that could be utilized by the United States. A very minimal engagement by the US diplomacy. The Doha deal, despite its flawed on the outset being flawed with respect to giving Afghanistan to a terrorist group, the Taliban, and withdrawing for no benefit at the end, there is a major component in that deal that envisions an intra-Afghan negotiation among Afghans, including the Taliban, that would lead to creating an inclusive post-settlement Islamic Afghan government. That component is there. That agreement was made with the Taliban. The only thing that the US and its allies needs to do is to make Taliban remain accountable to the deal that they have signed. The US has maintained their part of withdrawing all their troops. Now the Taliban have to do their part of negotiating with their own Afghans and reach an agreement to create a government that could be recognized by the international community. Such a recognized government would allow the presence of international community on the ground. You don't need to fly drones all over Afghanistan. You can't fly drones all over Afghanistan. You can't monitor every single group and every single camp. You need to be on the ground. You need to be present. You need to engage with the community. You need to create a stable, viable state. You need to have trusted partners on the ground. I hear discussions about reaching some sort of an understanding with Taliban that could cooperate on counterterrorism. I cannot believe how you would be able to verify that without being present on the ground. So it wouldn't take much, a little bit of diplomatic resources to engage Afghans abroad. That would naturally put pressure on the Taliban to come on the table, realizing that the international community is serious on engaging Afghans abroad on a future political roadmap and keeping the Taliban accountable. Hopefully, once that's done, another Bonn conference could be held to bring all Afghan stakeholders together, create an inclusive government, international community back in Kabul, having a stable, recognized government that could be a reliable CT partner on the ground. I think that's the future the US could look into. That CT partner not only will be a partner on counterterrorism, but will also be a partner in the future dealing with China or Russia, any kind of threat that would emanate from that region.
Henry Pforzheimer, as Sadiq laid out, I think what some of the that's sort of a best case scenario, I think, going forward. But in the near future, obviously, the U.S. has to balance several competing objectives: humanitarian, gender, counterterrorism, geopolitical, economic considerations. Where do you see the path ahead? What should take priority?
Well, what I think they are actually doing, and then what I think they should do. In terms of what I think they're actually doing is that they're giving humanitarian issues a fairly central role. They are at least, putting some money into that effort. And a lot of other things radiate from that, the efforts to figure out what will happen with the assets that were frozen in the United States and whether they can be re-injected into the Afghan economy. All of these conversations the special representative is having, it seems to come from the effort to bring Afghanistan back from the brink and ensure as much as possible that it's not a front page story. Where should it be? I think it should be intentional. I think that we should think of the future Afghanistan policy as being a multilateral one, because the United States really has no role as the lead in Afghanistan. It is not appropriate, and I think we should be letting others do more in this space. I also think that our Afghanistan policy should be better integrated into other policies. We have worldwide policies to prevent mass atrocities. We have policies that are in favor of, diversifying our sources of energy or minerals. And there are policies relating to Russia's other border, not the Ukraine side, but the Central Asia side. We should be paying attention to Afghanistan in that context. So bring Afghanistan out of the sort of standalone concern and remember that it is part of a lot of other policies and national security imperatives. I also think we have to make sure that our engagement is principled. We get to have an ideology too. And it should be the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That is something that we should make sure our policy greatly adheres to in every possible way. And the other thing we should do is to be clear. The Taliban have been effective negotiators because they are crystal clear about what they want and what they will do. And I think it's our turn to have that kind of clarity. And I would just suggest some linkages. For example, our human rights concerns are best linked to the very small amount of leverage we still have with respect to recognition. Our counterterrorism concerns can be linked to the sanctions regime that exists at the UN, which is a counterterrorism regime. And not only do I think that the travel ban should be reimposed against all Taliban who are listed under that regime, I also think that they should consider listing new entities. For example, the Ministry of Defense that is creating suicide squads. And finally, if there's economic support to be given, it needs to be linked to greater transparency by the Taliban about where their own funds are going, and also whether or not they have been interfering with humanitarian assistance. So I just think we have to be principled and we have to be clear as we go forward, and we have to be engaged in a multilateral way because the U.S. is no longer in charge.
Mm-hmm. A quick follow-up, if I may. At some point, I think it was 2009, a special representative for Afghanistan, Pakistan was created within the State Department. Mm-hmm. There was a separate SRAP's office. Yeah. You just spoke about the need to integrate. How do you think the State Department, having been your previous career, how do you think that they should go about approaching it?
Sure. I mean, the Special Representative's office is has been brought back into the South and Central Asia Bureau organically, and I think it will be further integrated. But I really think of the other parts of the State Department, in our economics bureaus of minerals and energy, or the Human Rights Bureau, or the International Organizations Bureau. I would think it's important for all of them to take back Afghanistan as an area of interest and concern. I think it was overly centralized into the Special Representative's office, and it's time for it to go back into all of the different parts of the State Department, Defense Department, the Treasury, Commerce, everywhere in the US government where it belongs naturally. Because I think Afghanistan is really important, has always been, and will always be.
Lisa, do you think, again, we have midterm elections in the U.S. coming up in November. We'll have a presidential election in 2 years in the U.S. Do you think Washington, in this climate, has the political will to give some kind of priority to Afghanistan? And if not, what kind of role do you envision for the United States in the region?
Well, I think I see some political will on Capitol Hill. And we still have the Afghanistan War Commission, for which many of the commissioners have been named. It's been very slow to get its start, but I think we can expect after the midterms that we'll see the Afghanistan War Commission get more engaged. We'll see hearings on Afghanistan, I believe. So I do think that there is more room for the U.S. Congress to get involved, and we can expect to maybe even see some legislation in 2023 related to Afghanistan. But we have to be honest with ourselves that China and Russia are definitely taking the U.S. focus. And even just today, there were media reports quoting unnamed intelligence officials talking about a massive shifting of intelligence resources from Afghanistan counterterrorism to the China challenge. So it is happening. But I would argue, similarly to my colleague here, that it's not just a question of how many resources are going into the challenge. It's about your strategy. It's about how you leverage like-minded partners and allies. So I think the U.S. can be smarter in what it's doing. I would reemphasize what Annie said about the travel ban should be reinstated. Of course, a few months ago, it was put on for a couple of the ministers of education, but the other Taliban leaders are free to travel. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, they showed up in Tashkent. So they're, gaining this international legitimacy 5 months after they have prevented Afghan girls from going to high school. This happened 1 week before the Taliban was shown to be sheltering al-Zawahiri. So, what are we doing here? Why are we engaging the Taliban? What is it accomplishing? What are the objectives? Because I know, people in the State Department will say, no, we have to engage with the Taliban. And I would just say that should be up for question now. We've seen that it's not accomplishing much. Perhaps maybe on the SIVs, you could make an argument that we need that kind of access to continue to get Afghans out of the country. But when it comes to human rights, when it comes to counterterrorism, I just don't see what the engagement is achieving. And I'm not the only one questioning this. I noticed today that Pashtana Durrani, who is the executive director for an education NGO called Learn, that operates in Afghanistan, when the interviewer asked her what she wants the international community to do for girls in Afghanistan. What can we do? Her answer was, I think the most important thing, and I'm quoting here, I would want the international community to understand is the fact that meeting the Taliban doesn't help. So I think we do need to consider that. We can't ignore what's happening to the women and girls. Look, they are not able to go to high school. Strict dress codes are being implemented. Most women cannot work outside of the house. They cannot travel without a male companion. I mean, these are brutal, and this is heinous repression of women and girls. And we simply have to stand up against it. And I think we have to remember the U.S. has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into NGOs that have empowered these women and girls over the last 20 years. Okay, so how can we just simply, turn our eyes, avert our eyes from what's happening to the very women are funding and support empowered? I think I'll end by saying that, the U.S. can and should do a better job of standing up on the human rights front. And I would just add that the counterterrorism issue is directly linked to what happens to the status of women. The way that women are treated moving forward will impact the extremism and terrorism trends in the country. You cannot split the two. They are directly related.
Last question before turning it to opening it up to the audience, to Minister Andarabi. What do you see as the way forward now? What kind of leverage does the United States and the international community, do you think, have with the Taliban?
I think in terms of what we can do, all the panelists have talked about. In terms of leverage, certainly Taliban are looking for money. The fact that Mullah Muttaqi can travel to Doha or elsewhere and meet someone by the name of international community is a need, so that they justify that they're there. This is a leverage. Who is meeting the Taliban, and are they allowed to meet? And what is the limit that we can set that you need to do this at least so that we meet you, and you don't need to do this so that we don't meet you? I think we are still, at least I hope it's changing now after Zawahiri and after 1 year. Still we are in that mentality of Doha talk. That thing should pass. The Taliban has enjoyed those meetings and those leverages and those luxury hotels and Doha and all the funds that they were receiving. Now they should be considered as people that violated the agreement and are not reliable, and they put in prison almost half of the country's population, and they supported the #1 enemy of the United States, and then still there are others. I mean, we know about Zawahiri's killing, but that's not the only one. There are thousands of others that are being freely moved. So there should be conditional engagement with Taliban, conditional release of funds, and conditional not only by the US, but the other countries, and even travels. I think once we come to that model, at least till we really define and come with a policy that determines other options that the colleagues talked, would be beneficial at this stage, so that the Taliban feel the consequences of their actions against the Afghan people, if we truly care about human rights, and if we really truly care about the blood and treasure that was spent in 20 years from American people and from others in that soil, in that area.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. If I can request that you please wait for your mic when I call upon you. If you could also introduce yourselves, and if you could please pose a question rather than a comment to one or more of our panelists. So if there are any in the front here, let's start.
Well, thank you. My name is Barakat. I'm a former Afghan diplomat. I have a question for Lisa and one for Annie. So during the time when United States was negotiating with the Taliban in Doha, you have been in office in the National Security Council and as a deputy assistant to former president's advisor. So my question is that what other options have been on the table? You've obviously strongly opposing the Doha Agreement and the negotiations with the Taliban. What were the other options on the table, and why they were not considered at the time? Who in particular was strongly pushing this agreement and this negotiation forward? And for Annie, do you think the current people in charge of the Afghanistan desk in the State Department, they are receiving honest advice? And the kind of discussion we had here about what are the options forward, why they are not considering this, because they are obviously engaging with the Taliban on the release of funds and more proactively than what we are expecting them to do. Thank you.
Lisa, you want to start?
Sure. So I personally would have supported keeping a limited number of U.S. troops on the ground. I think NATO would have kept 7,000 to 8,000 troops on the ground, enough to continue backstopping to a certain degree the Afghan National Security Forces, protecting our counterterrorism interest, but also giving more time for a genuine peace agreement to come forward. I think it wasn't that I objected to the very idea of engaging with the Taliban. I think that was necessary, but it was the fact that we hadn't really gotten a genuine buy-in to a peace process. The Taliban never gave up violence, and in fact, things got very bad toward the end of 2020, where they were literally assassinating government leaders and civil society leaders and female journalists. So the violence in some ways was getting even worse against the Afghan people. So there was never a genuine peace process. I think if we would have kept troops on the ground longer, there would have been a better chance that we could have catalyzed such a genuine peace process. But what were we dealing with? We were dealing with President Trump, who had made very clear he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. In fact, he had wanted to do that before he even left office. He was convinced that, no, we need to keep a certain number in. So there was about 3,500 or 4,000 U.S. forces on the ground in Afghanistan when President Biden took over. My advice had been that, if we had to withdraw troops, that we should do that in a negotiation with the Afghan authorities. that we had to make an assessment. Was the Taliban genuinely interested in a real peace process, which means, making compromise, giving up on violence for being involved in a political process? If we assess that wasn't possible, then maybe it wasn't worth it to try to push forward on the Doha deal, and we should just gradually negotiate our withdrawal with the Afghan authorities, which I think is what President Obama had actually tried to do. So in hindsight, perhaps there was something to that approach during the Obama years. You probably noticed that Ambassador Bolton resigned from his position in September of 2019. He had been a strong opponent of the Doha deal. You can read about that in his book. So I think once he was gone, there was really nobody at that level that was raising objections or pointing out some of the flaws in the deal.
Yes, and I'm trying to figure out how to answer this question. I would guess these are, either former colleagues of mine or people I have never met who are working on the Afghanistan desk now. First and foremost, they're going to be intelligent people who do their best to gather information from as many sources as possible. But I do think that they're doing it with real constraints. I think the message from the White House was pretty clear all along about what the policy was going to be, the continuation of as Lisa's pointing out, of some grave mistakes that were compounded by the decision a year ago, April. But right now, I would hope that what's happening on the desk is that people are trying to think of a new way forward, that a year of showing up for meetings and hoping that this time will be different, it needs to be discarded. And a new way forward needs to be found, and the United States, I believe, has to stop thinking that it's in charge. So that's what I hope the people are thinking about right now.
We'll take a few questions. So Seema, here in the front, and then.
Seema Sirohi, I'm a columnist for the Economic Times. My question is to Lisa and Minister Andarabi. Very short question. What do you think of what Pakistan is up to these days with the new government with the Taliban government in Afghanistan? And is the confusion leading to, lack of a proper response from the U.S.? Is the U.S. consulting Pakistan anymore? What is their role? Where are they right now?
And before you do that, maybe you can take another question here. Ma'am?
Hello, Miret Mabrouk from the Middle East Times. This is a question to Ms. Pforzheimer, Ms. Curtis, and Lieutenant General Andarabi. I'm just curious, this is a fairly US-focused discussion, but I'm just curious as to where you think other international players fit into this equation, whether it's the Gulf Arab states, whether it's our other European markets, whether it's Afghanistan's Asian neighbors, and whether you think their influence or involvement is helpful or detrimental to the U.S. position. Thank you.
Lisa, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, so to answer Seema's question, Pakistan's role, it's an excellent question. The U.S. clearly has to rely on Pakistani airspace in terms of any drone activity, unless it flies from the North Central Asia, but more likely it's flying assets from the Middle East. And it's highly unlikely that the assets are going to go all the way up and around through the north. They're not going to go over Iran. So that is one thing that the U.S. would need from Pakistan, just approval to use its airspace. But other than that, I don't really see that the U.S. is going to try to rely on Pakistan. For 20 years, we tried to cooperate with Pakistan, and there was very little that came of that. some cooperation on al-Qaeda in the early years right after 9/11, but really, in the last 18 years or so, there was, just not the kind of cooperation that the U.S. was looking for. The Taliban were harbored in Pakistan. They probably couldn't have made the kind of comeback that they made in Afghanistan had they not had a sanctuary in Pakistan. So to think now that the U.S. would get some kind of cooperation from Pakistan, I think would be really naive. So, it's not to say that the U.S. and Taliban the U.S. and Pakistan are arch enemies. No, there's a relationship there, but it will never be like it was during the last 20 years with the large-scale military assistance and economic assistance. In fact, that had started to come down anyway. President Trump had suspended most military assistance to Pakistan in 2018. So I guess the short answer is I don't think Pakistan really has much to offer in terms of trying to meet counterterrorism objectives in Afghanistan or to deal with the human rights concerns in the country.
On the question of the role of other actors?
Yeah, I think the U.S. should work more closely with like-minded partners, particularly European partners who are big donors to the country and share our values. The UN, as I said, we should be leading an effort at the UN to reinstate the travel ban. So there are other influential players that we should be working with. I'm not a big fan of this dialogue between Russia, China, Pakistan, and the United States. I just don't think those three other countries care about the human rights situation to any great degree in Afghanistan, and I'm not sure what it could really accomplish. So I would think the U.S. would accomplish more by working with other democratic partners who are like-minded, who share our values and interests in Afghanistan.
I think on Pakistan, what I would like to add is certainly the reason Taliban are today in power is because of the safe havens that the Pakistanis have been providing to the Taliban. Why they are not worried about such a terrorist group or radical group to be in power is because the Pakistani intelligence, I believe, has experience in dealing with those for the last 50, 60 years. So they have mastered, and they are thinking somehow they're going to manage it, which they are by sending different ulamas and engaging with the Taliban. But certainly it could pose, but not to the level that the previous government, the Pakistanis, were considering to be a threat, the relationship with India or a friendly Pakistan policy government. So that's why they know it's a fire, but they have been playing this for the last 40, 60 years that they are still believing that they could continue with it. And I think with the other nations, certainly the concerns that we are showing now or the Afghan government had during the Doha talk, that was the concern that most European countries had. The UK had, some regional countries had it. But it was mainly US's efforts that they were following because they were the lead in terms of how they're making decisions. Otherwise, till last days, I remember meeting other international allies of Afghanistan questioning what's going on with the peace talks. We're not very well aware of the end stage of it. So they had shared the concern as they're sharing it today. I think the Europeans tried to engage with the Taliban. But I think the Zawahiri has kind of alarmed everyone in terms of how they're doing. The region are very cautious. I mean, the Russians, the Chinese, the Central Asians, even the Iranians starting to engage the Taliban because nobody wants to kind of confront a terrorist with a lot of equipment that they have right now in hand and kind of trying to manage it in a way that doesn't turn on them. But I think they are equally worried about their presence and the instability that it could cause to the region. And then I would agree certainly that in the effort that panel proposed or that lays in the future, certainly there are countries that the U.S. could work together so that they could form that change.
If I can just ask a quick follow-up, what do you make of particularly the role of Tajikistan and the other Central Asian countries in this, and where do you see that? Obviously there are some intrinsic tensions and concerns about the Taliban there and the flow of radicalism into Central Asia.
To you. To me?
Okay. To you.
I think the Central Asia, the Tajikistan certainly is housing the resistant forces right now against the Taliban, but very, very cautiously. That's more out of the historical ties that lies between those factions and the Tajiks. But in reality, nor they have the resources, nor the capacity to kind of turn it into a big resistance against the Taliban. But at the same time, the Tajikistan is cautiously engaging the Taliban because of the worries from ISKP, Daesh, and others. So I think there is some uncertainty in that region as well in terms of what is the exact measures that they should take moving forward with the Taliban.
Any other questions? I think, yeah. Professor, in the back.
I'm Deepa Olapalli, research professor at George Washington University. And when the issue of leverage came up earlier, Minister, you said the money was one of the ways in which outsiders can have leverage over the Taliban. When you look at the 4 countries that have kind of recognized the Taliban, because it's Russia, China, Turkmenistan, and then Pakistan. So none of them, except for one at the moment, seems to me have that kind of deep pocket. So can you none of you mentioned the role of China in the in this Taliban period. Could you shed some light on that?
You want to talk on China?
Probably Lisa and both of you.
For me, okay.
Okay, yeah, why don't you? Yeah.
Okay.
I think, first of all, those countries did not recognize the Taliban yet. They are engaging, but not as officially recognized to that. I think when it comes to the Chinese, the only interest that the Chinese are, at least before, the major interest that they have is the ETIM, the East Turkestan Islamic movement, that had about 700 people present in Afghanistan, and they are engaging the Taliban since then in terms of how they could mitigate that risk that goes. And then the Chinese also has interest that other rivalry countries could use them against the China in Afghanistan. So that was their major interest. But certainly Chinese had some economical interests as well. We're hearing that not a major investment because they're not a lot of kind of risk takers. They're very slowly moving country in terms of making financial or business decisions. But we are seeing increased Chinese presence right now in Afghanistan, trying to see what they can do with the mines and other resources that they have. But I believe that their primary focus is still in the engagement with Taliban is more ETIM than other economical benefits, or engaging further than that in trying to kind of fill the gap that the US has put there in terms of managing the Taliban. I don't see that happening.
Yeah, I would agree with that. They're mainly concerned about groups that would target China, ETIM, and they may have long-term economic interests, Belt and Road Initiative, et cetera, but I don't think the Chinese would pour a lot of investment into Afghanistan when the situation is still so unstable. The Taliban has not come through on human rights issues or counterterrorism. So I think the Chinese would still be very cautious about investing in Afghanistan in any major way. I think they'll wait, they'll be cautious, they'll try to protect their own counterterrorism interests, but I don't think they are, I just don't have a concern that, the Chinese are going to be diving in a big way with their investments. I think they're going to be much more cautious, and I do think that the close linkages, which are now out in the open between Taliban and Al-Qaeda, is probably a concern to China as well as Russia. We were hearing very early on that the Russians had sort of bought into this idea that the Taliban might share power. They had changed, but I think they quickly realized that no, it's the same old Taliban, and kind of had some regrets about believing that there was going to be some kind of different Taliban in the country. So I think all the regional countries are fairly disappointed and are probably recalibrating their strategies as we speak.
I just wanted to add one note to that, which is that I think China has shown up in Afghanistan and taken, sort of these mineral rights in a way, my view, is in order for others not to. So that they, might go there and reserve and promise, but that's a way to make sure that they have their own, their own leverage when they want to use it, but also that nobody else can have access to the rare earths or the other minerals in Afghanistan. So it's a little bit of the worst of all worlds if that's the way China approaches it.
The big investment being the INAC copper
which they haven't actually
exploited.
But they have it for a couple of years.
Yeah, like decades, and they're that's sort of the model that I think they may end up following.
Mm-hmm.
If I may add to that point, I think, unlike what the panelists mentioned, I think China is now looking at Afghanistan. Initially, I think the concern were that staging of the U.S. troops in the neighborhood, that was the objective, to get the U.S. out. But then looking at how the Taliban came in, there were concern that this Islamist extremist group might at some point get legitimacy by the West and being an ally of the West in that region, that and Afghanistan is a neighbor with China, that it could undermine their interest. And I think the mineral is a way for them to get in, to test the waters. But I believe, given the theocracy versus the communist, the autocracies are going to cooperate much more than democracies are in certain ways. The Chinese are not going to the Taliban for women's rights. The Chinese are not going to the Taliban to talk about the minorities. They will be just discussing transactional purposes. And that relationship, I think, is going to be much more, there's a lot of much more focus, especially through Pakistan. I think they're trying to get them on board with the investment. And if that happens, as I stated earlier, Afghanistan is going to be an important player if the U.S. does not pay attention in the geopolitics of the rise of China and how China is looking towards the West.
Yeah. Final question, sir. If you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask about India and Afghanistan.
Sorry, if you could introduce yourself as well.
I'm Bo Lendman. So India and Afghanistan. We've spoken about all the other countries, but not India. So what is the prospect for Indian engagement with Afghanistan? I'm particularly interested in the economic and developmental issues.
I don't know. I'm the moderator, so I'm not supposed to answer questions, but I think it may end up coming back to me, unless somebody else has a view on Lisa or.
Well, sure. Yeah, I think India has been reacting in a bit surprising way more recently.
I want to say that.
With surprising. With the opening of the technical office, India was one of the last countries that I thought would do anything that even, smelled like potential recognition of the Taliban. However, they have made their own calculations, and they've opened up a technical office, not a diplomatic office per se, but to be able to engage and maybe look into economic humanitarian issues. And the other interesting point is that India, wanted to ship wheat in to help with the humanitarian crisis. Pakistan was objecting to transporting the wheat across Pakistani territory, and India worked with the Taliban. The Taliban convinced Pakistan to allow Indian wheat to come across Pakistan into Afghanistan. So, strange bedfellows, I think, are happening. But, again, I think India, like a lot of other countries in the region, is looking to cover their own interests, maybe see what they can get, maybe exploit some of the problems that Pakistan's having with the Taliban with regard to the TTP. They've had their differences over what Pakistan's expectations of how the Taliban should treat the TTP that attacks Pakistani territory. So I think India is just trying to do what it can, get what it can out of the situation for its own interest, like many other countries are doing, like China is doing.
I think I was also repeating that I was surprised with the recent Indian effort with the Taliban. But I think post-Taliban coming, like during the peace discussions and Doha Agreement and so on, despite the relationship that India had with the Afghan government, they fully started, I believe that they followed the American policy. They had no direct India kind of Afghanistan what to do. They just said, okay, we do whatever the US does. And then they kind of closed all the doors or all the diplomacy that could be possible that they would do it. So they were following the US policy at that time. And we have, I think what we see during 1 year is what Lisa talked about, try to kind of leverage and competition with the Pakistan. But certainly they do think that not much could be achieved through the Taliban itself, but rather to take steps that could show the Pakistanis that they could also influence the Taliban, but that will have its limitations, certainly.
Oh, sure. Quick one, only if you could just wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will ask the last question. As Mr. Amini talked about, the question the panelists can answer it, so Lisa or Anna. So you talk about, Mr. Amini especially, you talk about a future route map that a second bond can be an option for the a political settlement, that it can be an option that can bring the peace and prosperity in Afghanistan. But I will ask about the resistance right now is shaped in Afghanistan. What do you think that the U.S. and its allies, they have a responsibility to support the national resistance in Afghanistan? It could be an option or not. What do you think about it?
Sorry, and if you could just introduce yourself as well.
Oh, my name is Javed, and I'm a participant in this program. Thank you.
So should the U.S. be supporting a resistance?
I think Sadiq could
I will start. Yes, I don't think so. I don't think the U.S. should invest in conflict in Afghanistan, in war. We have had, Afghans have suffered for more than 4 decades of violence and conflict. We have, all the arms come from outside. We don't produce any, but all the bullets go to the Afghans' bodies, and the Afghans are getting maimed and injured and widowed. And that suffering has to end. I think one of the reasons that why we see countries like India engage with the Taliban and others, like the US and others, is along the same line. Is the objective is to not fuel the conflict once again, to try to see if these current existing authorities in Kabul have transformed, have changed, and are willing to engage and work with our Afghans. That what's wrong with having girls go to school? What's wrong with having women go to work? What's wrong with having Afghans engage with the world? What's wrong with Afghans having good relationship with India or Iran or any other country in the world? So I think that is the reason that they're trying to engage with these authorities that unfortunately have proved to be very uncooperative, which is why we are recommending here that they need to go a little bit extra to put the pressure on the Taliban and the existing authorities. And there are resources available at disposal of the US, India, and others, and Europe and others to make sure authorities in Kabul come to the negotiation table. The resistance have a role to play right now. You know, the people are suffering in certain parts of the country. And there could be legitimate reasons for the people taking up arms for their freedoms, for their livelihood, to guard themselves, to protect their families, to protect their honor and dignity. But that cannot be the path. We need to find a political way to resolve the conflict. And the only way to resolve the conflict is through negotiations, through Afghans sitting together, in a platform that's not just US-led, but UN-led, led by the international community, facilitated by the international community, but Afghans together sitting in a room, discussing their issues, and negotiating and agreeing on a path forward, and agreeing on a political mechanism that could be recognized by the international community, that we could engage with the world and live a human, civilized life in that part of the world.
Let's see, but maybe we go down the row and actually just also double as sort of final comments. At least.
Yeah, I would just say that all sounds lovely. That sounds wonderful. I just question how realistic it is, given the current situation. So what I would say is, okay, right now, I don't think the U.S. should be arming the resistance, providing material support. But I certainly think the U.S. should be meeting with leaders of the NRF. They're an entity. They, represent part of Afghanistan. So we should definitely be meeting. Our diplomats should be meeting with them. We should be listening to them. We should be, getting information. We should be hearing them out because they do represent part of Afghanistan, a large part of Afghanistan. Not to mention the fact that a lot of these leaders are people we have been working with for the last 20 years. So I think, it's one thing to say, to make a statement of fact. The State Department says, we are not materially supporting the resistance front. And just leave it at that, okay? That's fine. But we should not make any judgment about what they choose to do, right? It's their country. The Taliban is not respecting human rights. We haven't even talked about the extrajudicial killings. The UN in July reported 237 extrajudicial killings of former Afghan government and security forces. So this is not a group you deal with lightly. And if it's the National Resistance Front choice to rise up with arms, the U.S. doesn't have anything to say about that. And let alone these are the people that the U.S. was fighting with for the last 20 years. So I would just leave it at that.
I would just add to Lisa's comment. I think the resistant is people who kind of, why they started the resistance, because they were former ANDSF, they went to Taliban, did not pardon, it was just saying in the TVs, in realities they were harassed. So they were forced to go to mountains, and then they had weapons, so they're fighting the Taliban. I think that's what people are resisting. And that should not be the only way forward, certainly. There should be other political means. But that's a legitimate force that is standing there against the Taliban, against the atrocities, against saving themselves. And I think anyone would be supportive of such people. Yes, are we going to give them, arm them, increase? That's another different policy kind of question. But in terms of the legitimacy of that is absolutely legitimate.
I would just echo a little bit of what Sadiq is saying, that this is what his generation hopes for. And I think that is ultimately where we should put our strongest effort. And there are very few tools available. Everybody is right in their assessment of the Taliban and the ability to work with them or even around them. I would just say that we have at least a strong mandate from the UN Security Council that dispute resolution can take place in a, from the bottom up fashion with support by the UN and the international community, and that over a long period of time, that's the kind of dispute resolution that might stick. Self-defense is absolutely essential, I agree with you, but where will it lead? What we need is a process, as you're saying, that will lead somewhere. And so if there is a peaceful way of resolving disputes over time, that's the one that will engage the greatest number of people, and it's all, sort of investigated and researched that this is the kind of change that can lead to a more stable environment where civil war will not constantly recur. So that is certainly where I think we should be putting our policy energy, is into establishing that kind of dispute resolution and giving it some strength.
Thank you. I was remiss before closing in mentioning two things. One is we have a couple of publications on Afghanistan, one by Sadiq Amini, my colleague, in Foreign Policy, where he suggests some of what he discussed today as a path forward for U.S. engagement with Afghanistan and the region. And also another colleague, a visiting fellow, Kim Dozier, who's an award-winning journalist and who reported from Afghanistan, has written about her experiences, particularly with her interpreter, her Afghan interpreter, and both in Time magazine, and both of those articles are available. I'd encourage you to read them. With that, let me join me in thanking our panelists today. Thanks for all of you for coming, and thanks for a very wide-ranging discussion.